reading right now. Well, thank you everybody that's joining us tonight. We are so glad to have you as we've been listening to Carl talk, even pre-show. It's always fascinating and joyful. So I hope you have a great time tonight. My name is Kelsey Kennedy. I work at Cook County Higher Education. Our job is to provide education where you live. And that means for our local community that we do everything from college student support to helping high school kids figure out what they want to do next, to assisting people get laptops so they have digital access to things like this, as well as putting on programming and events. So if there's anything you ever need or you have a suggestion, you can live here locally or you could be from further away. Feel free to send me a message and I will do my best to build it. That's kind of my dream, is to do whatever you need to bring education where you live. As we're here today, I want to let you know that Carl will not be doing a PowerPoint, so you'll be just watching us. I would say you have some choices of how you want to view the screen tonight. You can go take your mouse to the right-hand corner and look at the view button and pick the speaker button or gallery view if you want to see the group and how they're reacting to all the fascinating things that Carl shares tonight. You also have the ability to take your mouse and drag it over top of Carl's picture, and you should see a little box that's blue that pops up, the 3 dots in it. If you click on that, you can pin it. So he will be the priority picture of what you see throughout the whole evening. We are encouraging you to ask questions, toss them into the chat. I'll read them off if we have moments where he pauses for a second. I'll share them. We'll also invite you later on tonight to unmute yourself, ask questions. This is really a community of learners. So please don't feel like you need to keep it bottled up. We want to hear your questions, but we also know he has limited time tonight. So that's why I'm asking you to put them in the chat to start. So that way we can get through his presentation and still have time. And I know that if you're going to have more questions, I absolutely know this because every time he talks, I have so many fascinating questions that come out of it. So we hope to have him come back in the future. And this isn't the last time. We want to say thank you to Grand Portage National Monument for partnering today on this. He is part of that as Carl, Ranger Carl, and you can go up there and see him anytime. He just said he had a full house of people that came up today from the ski hill. So I encourage you to go check it out. I do want to remind you this is being recorded. If you have questions, I'll be in the chat area tonight, and I'm actually going to turn on our live transcript too, because we know that sometimes hearing can be challenging during events. So that should be popping up on your screen. You can move it around if you want to, so you can see things better, or delete it if you want to. Let me know if you have questions. Carl, it's all over to you. Thank you so much.
All right. Good evening, everybody. I hope you had a nice day today, good meal, or you're looking forward to a meal after this. Yeah, I told Kelsey earlier, of all the talks I've given the last 30 years or so, this is my favorite one. And in a way, I think it may be the most important one. The title kind of says it all. It's Life of the Voyageur, smashing myths, discovering who they really are. I mean, I talk voyageurs all the time, and unfortunately, I hear a lot of bad things about voyageurs, and I'm talking other national parks, I'm talking other places I've been, other reenactors. There is no one that have more myths and lies about them almost than anyone I can imagine. It's kind of like lumberjacks in Minnesota with Paul Bunyan, you know, you can't think that every guy who ever lumbered in Minnesota was that tall and chopped down that many trees with his axe. I mean, he's blown out of proportion. And that is the same thing you see when people are talking about the Voyageur. I mean, first off the bat, right, there's 3 major players in the fur trade. And I probably mentioned this on our last talk about the fur trade, right? If we're looking at the fur trade, there's 3 major players, right? We have the English, right? We're talking 1763 to 1821 fur trade era. We're talking about the English or the Scottish who are trading. They are the traders. That's who they are. We have the natives, right? And they supply the furs. They are the ones who supply furs. Then you have the voyageur. That's the guy in the middle. I call him the unsung hero. I call him the innocent man of the fur trade. I mean, he's the guy who's moving the trade goods that these rich English purchased. He's the one moving the furs that the natives obtained. I mean, as I tell kids, and I told you this last time, they're truck drivers of the fur trade. That's what they are, right? They're not trapping necessarily or trading. They're just moving the stuff. And when people talk about them or you hear about them, the first thing that comes in your mind are these cartoon characters. They all have that real long beard, and scraggly hair. They're always named Pierre or Jacques, like every one of them, 1,500 voyageurs, either Pierre or Jacques. That's all their name. They all speak like Pepe Le Pew. How you doing? Good to see you. They're all speaking like that, and you get all these things. They got that toque on their head that hangs all the way down. They're wearing a sash. Of course, the sash is there to prevent a hernia from happening in portaging. They're all short, right? They're all about 5 feet tall. They love carrying hundreds and hundreds of pounds on their back, because who wouldn't love that, right? See, you get all these things about these voyageurs, and I'm here today to tell you who these guys really are. Because there's always that little bit of truth in everything, but boy, this poor guy, he sure to heck has been blown up to be something he's quite not. So that's kind of the myths we're going to shatter today. And I'm going to start it off in kind of a weird way. I'm going to read a couple quotes. I'm going to read you like 5, 6 quotes, and then get into what I think they are and who I think they were. So we're going to put these on because it's getting to be that time of my life, I guess. And the first 2 quotes I'm going to give you are unique quotes because they're coming from the beginning of the English fur trade. They're coming from the 1760s, and they're coming from military men, okay? So they're not coming from people involved with the fur trade. This is a look of how the English perceive the French Canadian. As we get into our talk, we're going to find out voyageurs are mostly French Canadian. But here is the thought of men who did not work with voyageurs, but the preliminary thought on the English and how they thought of the French Canadians. Now remember, French and Indian War ended in 1763. So these English were shooting at these French, and these French were shooting at these English just a couple of months or years earlier. So this is what they said about these guys, these French Canadians who were voyageurs. One man said that they were a most vile set, licentious ruffians, a troublesome set of lawless, disaffected people, an indolent, slothful set of vagabonds. Boy, that's not nice. Another guy wrote, they spend their miserable lives roving around in deserts and seating themselves among natives. They live a lazy kind of native life, almost as wild as savages themselves. These are just angry people. I think if you're not one of them, they don't like you anyways, And we're going to see with the next couple of quotes, these are going to come from people who actually hung and hang and worked and knew voyageurs. And we're going to get a little different taste. So let me read a couple of these. Now, the first one talks about wages a little bit among the voyageurs. And we'll get more into wages too. I just want to get some of these quotes out of the way. The first one was by Alexander Mackenzie, who we've talked about. This comes from 1799. And he says, were it not that the voyageurs spend all their wages and the extraordinary high price of bears and beaver, it would be to us a losing business. He's basically saying that if these guys didn't spend all their wages out in the bush, the company can't afford to pay them. Now, another quote says, this is coming from Ross Cox out on the Columbia River. He says, between rum and baubles, the hard-earned wages of years are often dissipated in a few weeks. You see, the company, as you'll find out tonight, has a lot of plans on how you can handle 12 to 1,500 voyageurs and still make money. It's difficult to run a business with 1,500 employees you have to pay and have enough money yourself to get rich. This is going to be a class on how that can happen. So keep listening tonight. To wrap up, there's a couple more quotes. This comes from John Lambert in 1805, hanging out in Montreal. He says the country people in this vicinity are mostly employed as voyageurs in the Northwest fur trade, and the cultivation of their farms is left to their wives and children. When they return home in the fall, they seldom bring more than enough to support them during the winter. Peter Newman, the author and historian who wrote those great books like Empire of the Bay, he wrote about voyageurs as being peons and free spirits at one and the same time. And now my last and favorite quote on voyageurs for this little section. This comes from a man who probably knew voyageurs better than anyone. This is coming from Daniel Harmon, who wrote 16 Years in the Indian Country. A man born in Burlington, Vermont, who was in charge of voyageurs, working for the Northwest Company from about 1800 or 1804 all the way for 16 years. He writes this about the guys he knew so well, and probably no one knew voyageurs better than Mr. Harmon. He writes, "They are not brave, but when they apprehend a little danger, they will often, as they say, play the man. They are very deceitful and exceedingly smooth and polite, and are even gross flatterers to the face of a person, whom they will basely slander behind his back. A secret they cannot keep, and they rarely feel gratitude, though they are often generous. They are obedient, but not faithful servants. By flattering their vanity, of which they have not a little, they may be persuaded to undertake the most difficult enterprises. All their talk is about horses, dogs, canoes, women, and strong men who can fight a good battle." There's some quotes on the voyageurs, the innocent man of the fur trade. So why hire these guys? Why is the Northwest Company? If the French and the English fought for years in the 1750s and 60s, why is a British fur company hiring French Canadians? You know, why do you even want them in the company? Well, I'll give you a couple of reasons. Number one, well, transportation makes up more than half the entire costs of the Northwest Fur Company. You got to have these people. Remember this perfect situation that I'm sitting in right now, Grand Portage. By canoe, I'm 8 weeks from the Atlantic. By canoe, I'm 8 weeks to the Pacific. I'm not way up north like some of you people think I am. I'm sitting here right in the middle of the world. So we need people from both sides to come here. This is the hub. This is, if any place is a hub, this is it. If there's no planes, trains, or automobiles in this world, and the world revolves around birch bark canoes or just canoes, I'm sitting not in Grand Portage, but in a Grand Portage that would resemble much more a New York City. So this important area here, we needed the transportation, and we hire voyageurs because number one is they're plentiful, and they're right there in Montreal where the company is starting. So that's the home. Now, how many do we hire? Well, it depends on the year. When the company starts in 1779, 1782, we're already hiring the Northwest Company as about 500 voyageurs. They believe that'll grow to about 1,500 voyageurs by the time 1800 rolls around. And you get to about 1812, and you're looking at about 2,000 voyageurs hired by this company. That means on any given day during the peak of the fur trade in the 1790s at Grand Portage, it would not be surprised to see 12 to 1,400 paddlers here. That's not talking the natives. That's not talking the English traders. That's just talking the transportation, the truck drivers of the fur trade. That's just the paddlers. Now, that's pretty amazing to think of 1,200 paddlers here, because right now, as I speak, there's probably about 400 people in Grand Portage. So that makes us one of those unique spots where the population of the 18th century was higher than it is today, at least at that point in summer. They hired them also because the French have always gotten along well with natives, and that's the key to the fur trade, obviously. If you don't have a relationship with the ones who supply furs, you're not going to make it. The fur trade doesn't happen without the native people, and not just the Anishinaabe. You know, the Northwest Company is dealing with about 14 different tribes, actually. And the French, they knew how to deal with tribes almost better than the English companies did when they came around. You have to remember people like Duluth and those guys, when they were coming through here in the 1680s and 90s, and the fur trade was coming here in the 1720s and 40s under the French regime. The way the French would work is they would show up, they would trade, give you some trade goods, you would give them furs, and they would leave. Native people like that. Come and trade and then get out of my yard. What they didn't like was that English way. The English way, like Hudson Bay was doing as early as 1670, is much more of a colonizing way. I'm going to come onto your property. I'm going to build a trading post, have you stand outside the door. Don't come in my buildings, and I'll trade out a window or trade outside to you. Here's the price. Here's the trade. Now go away. And we have the furs. That's the neighbor who would never leave. They didn't like that as much. So when the Northwest Company began, they knew that the French always had that nice connection with natives. And you see that connection even today. I mean, look where these French traders were hanging out at those places prior to the English coming. What do we call some of these places today? Well, we call them Mille Lacs, Lac de Flambeau, La Cour, right? They all got French names. I mean, open a phone book here on Grand Portage. What names do you see, right? Deschamps, Deschênes, Gagne, Lagarde, right? You see that French influence. The French has always been powerful here in relationships with natives. So here we have a British company, the Northwest Company, basically hiring enough men so they can masquerade as a French company. You know, it's exactly, the French traveled in canoes. We're going to travel in canoes. You know, Hudson Bay, they're not dealing with canoes up there. But we, the Northwest Company, look just like a French company. Even to the point of when we paddled our canoes, you might have seen images that were painted later on in history, but the company actually had a specified canoe flag. And what was it missing? Other than the flag that they flew at their trading posts, would have the Union Jack on the corner. The canoe flags just had a red background with a yellow NW for Northwest. We didn't want to even tell them we were English. Natives would see these canoes of voyageurs coming their way, and they would go, oh, great, here comes some more English trade. Wait, look, it's French guys. We love them. We're masquerading as a French company. So you hire these French. Natives like the French. It makes us look French. It makes us look nicer. So that's why we're hiring these guys. Now, where they were coming from, we could find voyageurs from all over the place. I mean, we got records of Black voyageurs. We have records of Swedish voyageurs. We have records of German voyageurs, English voyageurs, Norwegian voyageurs, but over 90% are your French Canadians. They're not from France. They're from French Canada. These guys live along the St. Lawrence River outside Montreal and Quebec. Living along the river, they know the water. Another plus to hire these guys. But some of the main pluses to hire these guys, well, they did the job for a couple of reasons. You hire these guys because there's a lot of them. They know the water. They're more docile. And what I mean by that is that they're not being hired directly in the middle of Montreal. If you look at St. Ours or St. Denis or any of these little parishes where they were coming out of, they're all the parishes that are surrounding Montreal. I saw once a video on cruise ships. Yeah, modern cruise ships, and how they hired people in the States to work on those cruise ships. And they were saying how they never went to major cities and recruited those people. They always went to mid-sized cities. They went to places like Mankato or Eau Claire. They thought the people in those mid-sized cities had the attitude that was better they wanted than big city people. And they said they had to go someplace to hire people where there'd be enough people to pick from. They couldn't go to small towns, but they looked for those medium-sized towns. And I think that might have fit into the Northwest Company's vision too. They didn't want people in the inner city so much as they wanted people on these outskirts, these people who are working. And it just happens to be that the people on the outskirts of Montreal were the ones that were more available because of unemployment happening. Unemployment. Another reason to become a voyageur. Became a voyageur often because back in those days, if your dad was a cobbler, you became a cobbler. If your dad was a roofer, you became a roofer. Voyageurs are the same way. You became a voyageur because your dad was, and his dad was, and his dad was. It was a family business. And that happened a lot more back in the day than it does now. I mean, it was still happening a lot in the 1920s and 30s. But in the 1780s and 90s and 1800s, boy, it was happening a lot. So there's guys who are being hired, and I mentioned numerous times because of unemployment. Montreal, right around the time of 1700, is about 1,000 people. All right, we think of a town of 1,000 people. That's Montreal in 1700. But now the fur trade starts for the English in the 1760s. Montreal has gone all the way up to about 3,500 people. All right, we all know towns of 3,500, right? The fur trade is beginning and the fur trade booms. Let's go to 1800. 1800, 10,000 people. Think of any town you know that's about 1,200 people, that's about 3,000 people, 3,000 to 4,000. And think of them going to 10,000 in 3 years. That's crazy. That's crazy. When the fur trade really starts kicking, only 12 years later, by 1812, just when the peak's ready to crash, peak started crashing 1802. But by 1812, Montreal is looking at 30,000. Okay. So think of that. You know, we just saw this town go from 1,200 to 30,000 in 110 years. That is amazing growth. Now, here's my little personal story of what happened to Montreal. And it's something that happened to me. My wife is from northern Iowa. We live in Grand Portage. We often have to drive down to northern Iowa. And the worst part about the drive, and a lot of you will agree with me, is that part when you have to go through the Twin Cities. We're not used to driving in the Twin Cities. That's the white knuckle part of the drive, right? You're always scared, you're always nervous, but we always knew for years, especially in the 90s and into the early 2000s, that if we can make it through the Twin Cities, there's a treat just on the other side of the Twin Cities, a small little town called Newmarket, Minnesota. It was beautiful, little farms. You could stop and buy pumpkins. You could stop and buy apples at these little farms. It was beautiful. There was a good reward for getting through the cities without damaging your car or your stress, that we could pull over to a small farm and get some produce. You know, nowadays when we go down to Iowa, you can't do that anymore. There are no farms in Newmarket. Newmarket now is nothing but new home subdivisions and condominiums. It's nothing but housing for everyone that lives in the Twin Cities. What has happened in many towns across the United States. As the cities grow, the first thing that gets knocked down on the outskirts of the city are the silos, and up come the subdivisions. And that is what's happening when you're Montreal and you go from 13,000 to 30,000 during the fur trade. These farms, and remember, 90% of these French Canadians are employed in the agricultural business. In fact, we all are in the United States. About 90% of us are involved in farming somehow at that time in history. So as these farms are being absorbed by this growing city, you have massive unemployment. These farm boys are looking for work. And it's not just a couple farm boys. It's a lot of farm boys because, well, they're French Canadian, which means they're Roman Catholic. My mother herself, my mom is a Catholic farm girl from outside Milwaukee. That's just like being a Catholic farm boy outside Montreal. All right, except she was born in the 1920s. She's got 5 brothers and 5 sisters. That's pretty common for a Catholic farm family. You don't find a lot of Catholic farm families that have 1 or 2 kids. You know, they're usually pretty big. So when those kids are out of work, that's a lot of kids out of work. And at that time during the fur trade, there is no government programs. So if you don't work, you don't eat, you die. So there's massive unemployment, and the companies know that, the fur companies, and they know these guys know the water, and they know the natives like the French Canadians. So they're going to be easy, ripe picking. So these guys are picked up, and these are the men who become the bulk of your voyageurs, your 90% French Canadians. So let's move on here a little bit. We're going to get eventually to the point of what these guys actually look like. The company hires 2 types of voyageurs. That's something very important to say. No one ever says that. When you see the Pepe Le Pew Jacques 4'7" voyageur who loves singing and loves carrying weight, they never tell you what type of voyageur he was, because for most people, a voyageur is a voyageur, a traveler is a traveler. But of course, as fur trade people, we know voyageurs are split into 2 different groups. There are 2 types of voyageurs, because like the nose on my face, which is Grand Portage, the Northwest Company here, who hired more voyageurs than any fur company ever did by far, they had to have people on one coast on the Atlantic, one coast on the Pacific, to come to Grand Portage and to head back to where they came from. So we had to have voyageurs on both sides of Grand Portage, and that's what we did. We hired 2 types. Now, they have different names. Yes, they're all voyageurs, right? They all wear sashes and toques and that, but there's 2 different types. So the ones coming from Montreal is the term you hear a lot of, and that's the term pork eater, the mangeur du lards, right? That is because there are pigs in Montreal. They can eat pork. They can eat pork fat. They can bring it with them in barrels. It's a diet that these guys can consume. Whereas the guys between here and the Pacific coast, there's not really pigs running around the wilds of Canada. So they're not eating that. So the terms for the guys from Montreal or the guys on the Atlantic side, they've been known as the comers and goers. They've been known as the Montrealers because they're coming from Montreal. They've been known as the pork eaters or the mangeur du lards. Now on the other side, we have the voyageurs coming out of the north. They're often called the Northmen. Makes a lot of sense. They're called the Northmen. They're called the Winterers. They're called the Evernaunts. The main difference between these 2 types of guys is that the Winterers or the Evernaunts, who are working at the trading posts, remember Grand Portage is like a Walmart distribution center, but we're operating over 100 trading posts in the Northwest. That area, those trading posts, that is the home for these Northmen, these Winterers, these Evernaunts. It's a year-round profession. These guys are voyageurs all year. The guys in Montreal, the Montrealers, the pork eaters, those are seasonal positions. Those are seasonal, and it works well. If we remember the Lambert quote earlier in the show, we mentioned that the farmers there, the Canadian habitants, are employed as paddlers in the Northwest fur trade, leaving the farms to their wife and children. That's what they do because the fur trade season worked perfectly for these guys. These guys were able to plant the crops, and then once everything was in the ground, it was then the time to go to Grand Portage with the trade goods. They would paddle here, get here in July, take that 6 to 8 weeks back. They would make it back to Montreal just in time for a harvest. It was perfect for these guys. Fantastic, it was perfect. So some guys were seasonal voyageurs, some guys were year-round voyageurs. How was that decided? Well, each individual guy. They estimate that probably 1/3 of the Montrealers became Winterers, is one thought. But, 18-year-old boys, and I know them because I was one, and a lot of you known or have been 18-year-old boys. I always tell people at the park, there are 2 types of 18-year-old boys. There are two types of boys when they turn 18 in this world. There are those 18-year-old boys that will tell you that when I'm 18, I'm getting out of here. I've been living under mom and dad for 18 years. And when I'm 18, I'm getting out of here. I'm an adult. I'm moving. And they move far away. Or they join the service and they move out and they go shipped across the country somewhere. And they're just out of mom and dad's hair and they're not looking back. Then there's another type of 18-year-old. There's an 18-year-old that says, when I'm 18, I'm out of here. I'm getting out from mom and dad. I'm moving away. And they get an apartment or live in their friend's basement a few blocks away because they're like, I'm moving away from mom and dad, but not too far so mom could still do my laundry on weekends. There you go. Do you want to move into the middle of nowhere, Canada? That's your first kind of 18-year-old. Do you want to stick close to home? That's your other kind of 18-year-old. Maybe you got a wife and kids. You might want to be the seasonal voyager. Maybe you don't. Maybe, and some of these guys had to leave Montreal. They wouldn't tell you why. You can guess, but they just knew that they had to leave Montreal. They didn't care where they were going. They just couldn't stay there. So you have these two types of voyagers, right? Working in the fur trade. The Montrealers. Now, these guys were not fans of each other. Each one thought the other one was a discredit to the name of Voyageur. Yeah, it's been well documented that these guys are not fans of each other. We all think they're all just voyageurs, but to them, there's prestige in this work, you know, especially if it's a job that your dad did and your grandfather did and your great-grandfather did. There is prestige in this job. And if you were a Northman, they didn't really care for a lot of the pork eaters. And the pork eaters, they didn't care for the Northmen so much. And you can kind of see that in their mindset. You know, if you're a Northman, you could be looking at a Montrealer, right? A pork eater. And you might be calling him a pork eater in slang and say, how disgusting is it that you think yourself a voyageur? You don't go on the rapids and the cascades and the chutes and the falls of the far northwest where it's so cold you would freeze to death. Instead, you just sit there and paddle around in a bathtub called Lake Superior. Then you don't even do it all year. You come here, you go back, and then you settle in your little cabin with a fireplace with your wife who paints her face. I'm a voyageur, would say the Northman. I'm up there in the middle of nowhere, living among the native people, working year-round as a voyageur. Well, you can see what the Montrealer might say, or the pork eater. He might look at the Northman and say, you are no voyageur. I am a voyageur. I am on mighty Lake Superior. She never gives up her dead, you know. She is the most dangerous body of water in the world when you're on little rapids and little creeks and little puddles you're going on. Then you go up there in the middle of nowhere and live like a savage. Then you marry a woman, a native woman, and you act like them up there. You get tattooed and you mark your body and you have children, you know, and you're not even married by anybody up there. And you're having children out of, you know, not under the eyes of the church, and you're getting married not under the eyes of the church. And you're not even being a good Roman Catholic when you're up there doing those things. And how can you call yourself a voyageur? So you can see this weird dichotomy that's happening between these two guys. Now, the craziness of all this is that normally these two didn't cross paths, except for summer when they met at one place, Grand Portage. When they get here, we just happen to put them right next to each other. We separate them with the roaring and treacherous Grand Portage Creek, which is about a bubbling brook about a foot deep. It probably became the bathroom for all these guys. And of course, there was also alcohol given. So two groups of men who don't like each other, you separate them by a foot of water and a bunch of alcohol. It probably was not a good mix. But this is where it occurred, the one place where these guys would fight. So anytime I talk about voyageurs, truck drivers of the fur trade, the innocent man of the fur trade, I always make sure I tell people that keep in mind there's two types. You know, the guys in the 25-foot canoes going up into the northwest, the guys in the 38-foot canoes going to the east, right? They're both in canoes, they're both wearing sashes, they're both wearing toques, they're all voyageurs, but there's two types. Just like there's two types of bikers in this world. You know, there's guys who own black leather and own Harley Davidsons and wear the leather and ride their Harleys and go into taverns you should not go into. All right, I think we know who we're talking about. There are also guys who have enough money to afford a set of leathers, have enough money to afford a nice Harley Davidson, and on the weekends with their buddies go out touring on their bikes. They go into bars you probably should go into, because since they have enough money for leather and enough money for a nice bike, they probably got enough money to buy you a glass of wine. They're all wearing leather. They're all riding Harleys. They're all wearing toques. They're all in birch bark canoes. All bikers are the same. Nope. And all voyageurs are the same. Nope. So there's another analogy you can use when you're talking about the world of voyageurs. A lot of these guys, up to 1,000 of them, are being paid by the company. We're going to get into some nitpicky stuff right now. So they're getting paid, usually signing contracts. I've seen 1-year contracts, 3-year contracts, 6-year contracts. They're not paid poorly. They really aren't. People, that's another misnomer, you know, that they're all paid lousy, you know. It's not that they were paid lousy. They were paid pretty much what other people are being paid in Montreal. The problem is that almost all the time, they took their money in credit in the company's store. And the company's store, well, a gallon of milk is about 3 to 4 times higher than it is back in Montreal. So if you're getting paid an average wage, if you're getting paid minimum wage, and you move to a place that everything costs 4 times more, it doesn't work out. It doesn't work out. That's what happens. The company tried to sell these guys anything they needed, an extra pair of pants, an extra shirt, a bottle of rum, and they charged them at these enormous prices that quite often a lot of the voyageurs were in debt to the company. Now, the voyageurs in Montreal, they didn't need much. So they got paid when they got home. The voyageurs in Montreal actually made money. You can actually see the standard of living for a Montrealer going up. There's a great book called Peasant, Lord, and Merchant by Alan Greer. And he writes in this book how the standard of living among the French Canadian habitants who become voyageurs actually was starting to drop in the 1760s because of the grain. The wheat fields of Montreal died from overproduction. They were shipping grain out to Europe in the 1730s, 40s, 50s. In the 1760s, the soil was just broken. They weren't getting the same wheat production. So the amount of money French Canadians made in the 1760s and 70s started going down, but it came back up the standard of living in the 1780s. Why did it? It's because they were hired by that time by the Northwest Company. By the 1790s, that standard of living went up, and it kept going up until the 1820s. Yeah, that supplemental income of that summer job of being a paddler lifted the average standard of living for French Canadian habitants. Now, is it just a coincidence? It is not. Because in 1821, all my favorite fur trade fans out here, you know what happened in 1821. It was the merger between Hudson Bay and the Northwest. After the merger was signed, no longer were we shipping things out of Montreal. It all got shipped out of the bay. And the Hudson Bay Company no longer needed the service of seasonal voyageurs. Seasonal voyageurs no longer being offered jobs. That standard of living after 1821 went back down. So was the fur trade good for voyageurs? If you're a Montrealer, it was. But how about the guys in the North Country? How do they fare? Everything they needed, they had to buy from the company store at inflated prices. And there's something else those guys up there do. In the winter, many voyageurs, most of the voyageurs, left trading posts. They didn't all work in the trading post all winter. Winter's slow. Winter, a few furs come in, you got to bundle them, you have to chop wood, you have limited amount of food. So the Northwest Company pushed voyageurs into the bush during the winters. A lot of people don't know what voyageurs did in winter. The voyageurs in the fur country were pushed into native villages. They were told to take native wives. And these guys, being young men, they wanted to take wives, but it was a ploy on the company. The Northwest Company knew that if these guys were living with natives, we wouldn't have to worry about trying to feed these guys. Plus, we told these guys to keep an eye on the furs that were coming in during the fur-bearing season of winter, to make sure that those furs were going to be used to trade with us, and make sure they're not hiding furs to trade with Hudson Bay or somebody else. They literally told the voyageurs to spy on their neighbors to make sure they're not keeping furs for the enemy. So the company promoted these marriages and promoted these guys to move into native villages, and many, many did. The journals mention this all the time. These guys would take native wives. And let me tell you something else about wives, because I got one. She's probably watching me right now. And a lot of you who are married will know this is true. Wives, they cost money. Yeah, they want stuff. So not only are you buying the stuff you need for inflated prices from a trading post, now you got to buy stuff the wife wants and needs. She needs a new kettle. She needs a new blanket. All right, I'll put it on the credit, you know. And wives, you know what wives lead to? Kids. And guess what? Yep, kids cost money. I know that. I got 2 of them. So now you got to buy things for these kids too from the company store. And that becomes an issue when you're trying to outfit a whole family that you're living with all winter. That is why as much as 83% of voyageurs in the interior went in debt to the company. Some of them as much as 10 to 15 years in debt after 1 year of service. Yep. Just sign up for another year. We'll forgive your debt. That's owing your soul to the company store. That's a lot of money saved. Company doesn't have to pay these guys. So remember that first quote early on, we talked about that? This is an example of that. So was the fur trade good for these guys? Well, it's owing your soul to the company store, but you know, at least they weren't back in Montreal starving to the death on the streets because they were unemployed. So that's something else to figure out about voyageurs. Did they love their job? Probably not. I mean, just looking at the job in the plain eye of anybody here, you know, you're leaving the paddle 3 to 4 o'clock in the morning. A lot of these records point out between 3 and 5. 6 is too late to get on the water, it seems like in these journals. They're leaving at 3, 4, 5 in the morning. And it's not unusual to see them paddling at 8 or 9 at night. Those are long days of paddling. And when you're not paddling, you're portaging 2 90-pound packs, you know, carrying 180 on your back. No, they probably didn't love their job, but you know, physical labor was used to everyone. They did have something called corvée. You might come across in journals. Corvée is nothing more than 6 days of labor owed to the company, and it was often dished out at Grand Portage, which means that after spending 6 to 7 weeks of paddling here, when you got here, you get to relax, except for the 6 days of labor you owe the company, which is labeled under corvée. Did they sing all the time? Now we're going to go fast and furious, knocking out some of these fallacies of voyageurs. Yeah, they did sing a lot. And we know they sang because you can tell these songs when you dissect some of these Voyageur songs, they're mentioning parts geographically that only voyageurs would know. only Voyageur routes would go through some of these Talon Falls, and some of these cascades that were mentioned in these old songs were bypassed when the fur trade ended. So these songs sometimes mention places that only Voyageurs know. So we know we can go back to that time. Did it help keep rhythm? It probably did. I spent a lot of time in canoes, and the only thing I can say is that I've realized that when paddling and singing songs, it's joyful for about an hour. And then you're like, shut up. You get sick of it. And at least that's what I found out. And most of the guys in the canoe find the same thing too. So it was a nice, break. We should talk about the dreaded hernia, right? Because that's the big one. People, the number one cause of death is hernias. Now I did a talk on the death of the Voyageur, looking at dug up graves of Voyageurs and stuff, and see what they mostly died from. The number one cause of deaths that I can find is starvation and drowning. Because you're going through areas that have been trapped out for years, and starvation happened everywhere, and drowning happened. Drowning happened because there's that rumor that if you're a Voyageur, you don't know how to swim. They would never hire Voyageurs that could swim, because they wouldn't take a chance with the canoe overturning. The matter of fact on that is most people don't know how to swim back then. Most people today in their 20s know how to swim. You ask some people in their 60s, you'll find a couple that don't know how. You talk to some people in their 90s, you'll be surprised at how many don't know how. It's just recently more and more people learn to swim. It's something you do in free time. You learn how to swim. Well, back in the day, people didn't have as much free time. I know it seems like you don't have a lot today, but trust me, it was tougher even in the 19th century. Remember that show Little House on the Prairie? Remember little Half Pint coming home and telling Pa that when she got home from school, she's going to go to the swimming hole? No, if that was a real show, first off, Half Pint would be lucky if she went to school. She should be working on that farm with Pa. And then if she did go to school, when she came home, to leave them and go to the swim hole? There's something called chores, kids, So swimming was not something common. So most Voyageurs probably did not know how to swim, but we know, of course, of some that did. We see journal records of men swimming across with a rope or swimming out to catch things that fell out of the canoe. So no, they did not hire Voyageurs that could swim. They hired anybody they could. It made no difference if they could swim or not. But for hernias, 3 books. And I'm not going to mention. One, Grace Lee Newt's book, The Voyageur. There's a couple of them. I think Eric Morse's book, maybe 2. But there's 3 books that mention that hernias is the number one cause of death of Voyageurs, and I disagree with that. Am I saying that hernias never happened? No. I know of 4 references, and 3 of those references, people died. In fact, I'll read you one of those quotes on hernias, because this one says a lot of people died. So this is October 1803. This afternoon, one of our men departed this life, and it is thought that what hurried him out of this world was his having forced too much in carrying on the portages, a circumstance that occasions the death of many of our people yearly. In fact, we have the 1797 inventory of things that were at the Grand Portage that year. And in our inventory of things that were hanging around the post here, there were 6 rupture trusses to help with that problem. So it did happen. It may not have been the major cause of death, but obviously many did succumb to that. And I don't know, because I'm not a medical guy, if the sash actually would have helped them or not. The physical maladies of Voyageurs, one of the big things you see in graves looking at Voyageurs, there's this mastocloidal muscle. It's actually the muscle that connects your jaw under your ear to your clavicle. There's a muscle that connects these two. You see those when weightlifters pick up heavy weight all the time. Those things stretch right out. When you're portaging, that muscle takes most of the strain. And because that muscle is being pulled more than it used to, it causes excessive bone growth at the back of the jaw here and on the clavicle where where that muscle attaches. And when you look at Voyageur graves, you can see the extra bone growth on those things from portaging, just like you can see the compressed spine from portaging. Two very telltale things looking at graves of voyageurs that pop out. Just kind of a cool little fact there for you. Voyageurs a lot of times would run away because this job could be tough. Another term you might have come across in voyageur research is batailleurs. That is a French term for thugs that were hired by the Northwest Company, guys who were basically bounty hunters sent out to capture guys who would run from the company. And they say of all the things you could do to a voyageur to upset him being caught was to put him in chains and parade him around other voyageurs to lose his face. Because once again, this goes back to who these guys are and how proud they are of this profession. So they hated that. On a weird side note, one of the tortures to some voyageurs who departed was Rainier Lake can get to 100 degrees, and the building that held the black powder had a tin roof. And on a 100-degree day, they made the bad voyageurs sit on top of that tin roof for the day as a treatment of being bad boys. So we got running out of time. Look at the physical look of the voyageurs. This is the fun part. The toque, the classic voyageur toque, that knit hat they wear, right? You always see it hanging all the way down. I did an article on the toque wearing of voyageurs, and I looked at original art, and ironically, 25 of the images had the toque hanging to the left, 25 had it hanging to the right, 25 had it hanging back, and 25 had it standing straight, tall up. The men in their high hats standing with their paddles, says Letitia Hargrave in Lachine outside Montreal, watching the voyageurs leave. So the toque was worn all different ways, any way you wanted to wear it, but apparently wearing it high and tall was a very common way. And it's the one way you never see reenactors wear their toques. They all wear it to the left or they all wear it to the right. You never see them wearing it straight, high, and tall. And I always think that's because nobody wants to look like a gnome in a garden. That's my theory. Yes, they wore sashes. Did they have beards? Well, we can document them having beards, especially in winter. But for the most part, every voyageur you see on cartoons have beards. But for the most part, no, they're clean-shaven men. And that's simply because of the time frame we're in. We're in the 1790s, folks. It's the era of the clean-shaven face. You all know the stupid hat of the 1790s, what we call the tricorn, right? That three-corner hat. What a useless hat. It's like wearing a gutter on your head. Why is those sides turned up on that hat and the back turned up? Because it's showing off the man's clean-shaven face. This is the era of clean-shaven faces. Look at all your founding fathers. Now, none of the signers of Declaration of Independence had a beard or a mustache. It is the era of clean-shaven faces. So the voyageurs mostly were clean shaven. And even looking at the few images we have of voyageurs, and by the way, if you're looking for images of voyageurs, you're not going to find any till about 1821. And that way the fur trade's about over. Language. Did they all sound like Pepe Le Pew? No. According to Daniel Harmon, most of the men couldn't speak a lick of English. He cried along with Willard Wenzel. They cried about not having anyone to speak to, and English was their main language. So the voyageurs mostly did not speak English at all. Most did not know. They had tattoos. That's a very important fact. I think I'm going to get back to that in just a second and wrap up some more of these myths. Average age of voyageurs, 26. All right. How about this one? The average height of a Voyageur. I've seen Voyageurs 5'1". I've seen Voyageurs 6'2". Oh, you couldn't be tall if you were, no, they'd hire anyone. What was the average height of a Voyageur? 5'7". 5'7". Now, Carl, how do you know that a Voyageur average age is 26, and how do you know the average height is 5'7"? How do you know this? Well, I can tell you how I know this. First off, the average Canadian man fighting in World War I was also 5'7". The average height today in the United States is 5'10". The average colonial man was 5'8". Were they shorter at 5'7"? Yeah, but not by much. Everyone thinks Voyageurs were very, no, they were slightly smaller. And a lot of that had to do with their diet. People in Montreal today have a lower average height than the average Canadian. Kids in Saskatchewan grow to be big and tall. That's where all the Black Angus beef comes from for your McDonald's burgers. But Montreal's always been an agricultural district. So when you see college hockey or high school hockey coming out of Canada, you see these 6'4" full bearded Saskatchewan kids losing to the Montreal kids who are 5'7" and look like they're 12 years old. And the only reason the kids from Montreal are winning is they're so fast, the big guys can't catch them. So it has to do with the geographic area and diet. But how do I know Voyageurs are 5'7"? How do I know Voyageurs' average age was 26? And that's because of something called the Canadian or the American License Law of 1816. This is a very important part of this talk and a great spot to get nearing our wrapping up point. In 1816, a guy called John Jacob Astor, hey, we got to that guy's name, right? The multimillionaire fur trader. Astor petitioned the United States government to put the license law in effect. He did not want foreign fur companies gathering furs on US soil. He said only Americans like me, he was born in Germany, by the way, they said only guys like me, Americans, should profit from getting furs on American soil. And we still have French Canadians and all these other guys coming in, British coming in and trading still, and we're trying to kick them out of here. Plus, we have a problem. The War of 1812 was over, but they were still having a problem with people coming into this country, and we were still reeling from the War of 1812. So they were trying to limit a little bit of who's coming into the country with immigration. So what the United States government did was they passed the they passed the license law of 1816, forbidding anyone involved with the fur trade who was not American from entering the United States. And everyone who had businesses on the Great Lakes threw a fit. If you own a shop on Lake Erie, Lake Huron, Lake Ontario, Lake Michigan, and you shipped cogs and widgets, you know who you hired to move these things around the Great Lakes? You hired French Canadian voyageurs. Voyageurs were not just fur trade. These truck drivers were used by other people as transportation. So voyageurs were hired by guys in Detroit to move their cogs in 1812, you know? So these guys realized that if they got rid of all French Canadian voyageurs, their businesses would go under. Just like today, if you tell companies they can't use truck drivers, businesses will go broke. So the United States made an exception. They said nobody can come in involved in the fur trade and collect furs on US soil if you're not an American, except for French Canadian voyageurs in the transporting of these goods. So they said you can use French Canadians in transport, but you can't be an outside company coming into the US owned by an outside than a US company. But you can use French Canadian voyageurs in the United States, but we need to know their name, we need to know the color of their eyes, we need to know their height, and we need to know their age. It's simple. You look at the 1816 license papers, and you can find out that those employed in the trade on the Great Lakes in canoes, French Canadians employed in transportation, averaged 26 years of age and averaged 5'7" in height. There you go. Yeah, a lot of people never thought about doing that. And it was something that I did not come up with. There was a great guy down in the Twin Cities by the name of Rich Williams who uncovered that fact and did the research. And I think it's one of the greatest points of fur trade research I've seen is that 1816 license law. Here's our dramatic kind of wrap up here. I mentioned voyageurs having tattoos. I'm going to shoot you with two more quotes here really quick. The voyageurs' bodies are tattooed with designs of plants and animals. You wouldn't be accepted as a real man among the Indians of the Great Lakes without being tattooed. That's in the 1780s. And then we have Cadoux is being himself tattooed by Lafreniere, as already has Boissel. Lafrance and Fries came back before today, as Lafrance wishes to be tattooed. That's 1801. And the last one is his legs and arms and breasts are tattooed, marks of superiority in his profession, which has been that of a voyageur. You know, here's our dramatic ending. The Montreal Gazettes during the 1820s and 30s often wrote obituaries of bodies that were found drowned in the river. And a couple of them would say that we found a body in the river. He was recognized as so-and-so, so-and-so, Louis Perrault. We did not know what Louis did for a living until we noticed marks of his profession. And you see that term, marks of his profession. That is speak-say for the word tattoo in Montreal. You see, I told you there's two types of voyageurs. The ones in Montreal were seasonal. They came to Grand Portage, got back, lived with their wives, and retired there. When they would walk the streets wearing their clothes they wore as voyageurs in the summer, their hats festooned with ostrich plumes, the children would run up to these Montrealers, these pork eaters, and say, "Tell us, old man, tell us the stories of you going to Grand Portage. Tell us the story of the mighty voyageur in big canoes on Lake Superior." And children would follow these guys, and they'd be like heroes. But the men from the North Country, they stayed up in the North Country, remember? A lot of them could not go back to Montreal. They couldn't tell you why they left, but they couldn't go back. But some did. And when they got back, they never told anyone what they were doing. Where have you been for the last 12 years, Carl? I've been around, just, working around Quebec and stuff. You don't tell people you were a voyageur in the North Country because you're doing things up there I mentioned earlier. You're taking a wife, not under the eyes of a church. You are having children. You're not supposed to have children outside the church. You're not supposed to marry a woman who's not Catholic. You're not supposed to get married without a priest. You're not supposed to mark your body as a Roman Catholic. That's why the tattoos I mentioned is why you're hearing them on the legs and on the chest, never on a place. They never say, "Oh, we tattooed his face. Oh, we tattooed his hands." No, never on a place so they could be seen in church on a Sunday. These guys knew if they went back to Montreal, they had to keep that on the low. Nobody, if you told somebody you were a voyageur in the interior, I went up in the North Country, had a couple of kids, had a native wife, got tattooed, you would be like, oh. No. These guys did not have the kids respecting them as they walked down the streets. They kept those things private and what they did in their life. And that's why so many of them stayed up in the Northwest. They stayed up in the Northwest, and that's where you get the start of free Canadian villages. Guys who got too old to be a voyageur and retired, and they lived outside the trading post, And then their children, those mixed blood, those Brûlés, those Métis, they got involved into the fur trade. So these free Canadian villages grew and grew and grew and grew and grew, And as the fur trade ended and the fur trade collapsed, what happened to those free Canadian villages that were surrounding the trading post? Well, I'll give you their names today. Calgary, Edmonton, Green Bay, Prairie du Chien, Thunder Bay. Over 30 North American cities are basically free Canadian villages that continued after the fur trade. That's what they are. So don't be sad for these guys in the North Country that never had the kids telling them how great they were, because they left quite a legacy of over 30 North American cities. You know, I call him the innocent man of the fur trade when I began this talk. The English had lots of money to buy lots of trade goods and trade them to make a lot more money. It was rich guys getting richer. Natives did not need the trade. They were living fine without us. Yes, we made their life easier. Yes, the trade was good for them in a lot of ways. But they didn't need to trade. The natives never needed to trade. The Voyageur companies, the fur company guys never needed to trade. But the Voyageur, unemployment, starving to death on the streets, they needed the fur trade. The fur trade they're the innocent man, but they were the ones that were needed. You know, they don't get the credit all the time. You know, we talk about Mackenzie beating Lewis and Clark to the Pacific coast by 10 years. Sure, Mackenzie was in that canoe, but he wasn't the guy sitting in the front of the canoe. He was probably sitting in the middle. There was probably some unsung voyager that made it to the Pacific coast first, you know? So I call him the innocent man of the fur trade for those reasons. He's an important character, and he had an important job, and he was proud of it. Are there questions on Voyageurs? I know I could have gone on longer, but time really kind of flew on me.
There are questions. Somebody was just asking, what is the policy for asking questions? So one, you can put your questions in the chat and I will read those off. The other one
I'm in no rush, so yeah.
Yeah, and then if also we'll invite people to unmute closer to the end, and if you want to ask a question yourself. So one of the questions that came up is the Voyageur sashes, were they special or woven or braided in a special way? Tell us about the deal with the sashes.
Yeah, you know, there were finger woven sashes, but there also were factory woven sashes that were coming in already by 1802, 1804. The bulk of the sashes coming in on journal records were red. They were red sashes, but the more colorful ones and the more bigger patterns, same thing. After 1802, 1805, you see those fancier ones coming in. But when you do look at a few of those images, even 1820 of Voyageurs, and that's like really the year, probably the best artist of Voyageurs is John Elliott Wolford, who in 1821 came all the way out here and painted thousands of pictures of Voyageurs in 1821. They're almost all red sashes. They're almost wearing like uniforms, red toques, red sashes, white shirts, and gray pants. Very common look. Even the artwork by a guy called John Bly, same thing. But finger weaving is a unique type of weaving. It was a cottage industry. Northwest Company would hire women in Montreal, French Canadian women, to do those and make those. So those were mostly made by French Canadian women and not by Native people, though Native people learned the skill and they were producing finger woven garments as well. So yeah, it's an old style though. It actually goes back to a French style of finger weaving. So there's always a debate on where it began, who started it first. There's distinct patterns that only natives did. You know, there's the flame pattern, there's the flame pattern, there's the assumption pattern everyone talks about. So sawtooth edge pattern, oblique pattern, that's always done by natives, what they call the oblique pattern. So yeah, but you know, and one reason why a lot of people are wearing them, Canada's cold. You know, nowadays when we get cold, we put on our super polar tech coat, you know, but back in the day, if you got cold, you put on 3 shirts instead of 2. And if you got really cold, you put on a jacket. You got really cold, you put on 2 jackets over 3 shirts. You just kept adding layers, and a sash is easier to adjust with all these layers than a belt with a million holes on it. And you know who wore sashes in Montreal? Doctors wore sashes, lawyers wore sashes, schools had different sash colors for each school. Sashes were worn by everyone. It's not just, oh, look, a sash, he's a Voyageur. No, It's like today looking at somebody going, oh, look, he's wearing a belt. Must be a Voyageur. No, everybody wore them.
Well, that's wonderful. We're starting to get more questions in the chat. One of them is, tell us about how these people learned how to paddle canoes and survive on the water for the time frame that they were traveling when they were maybe farm boys that didn't have exposure.
Yeah, well, they were used to the water, and nobody knows. No one comes into this profession knowing how to paddle a canoe, because paddling a fur trade canoe is a million times different than paddling a canoe that you have. You know, everyone here has paddled probably two-man canoes where you feel it in your arm and you feel it in your chest, and you do that little J stroke at the end. And every time you do that, you know you're the one making this thing move. That is not how fur trade canoes work. If you try doing that famous 50, 60 paddle a minute like Voyageurs, your arm will fall off and you'll go, how did they ever do that? Well, I'm here to tell you how they did that. Paddling a fur trade canoe is like riding your bike downhill. The hardest part of your paddle is the first few minutes of the day, when you all put that paddle in the water and you pull it and nothing moves because it's 4 tons in this canoe. Then it slowly starts moving. Then once it gets moving, you just put that paddle in the water, and it's a very short paddle because with 4 tons, you only have about 6 inches of freeboard, and it's very narrow bladed because you're not feathering anything. You're not J-stroking at all. You're not concerned about steering this canoe. You have a guy in back with a big rudder called the gouvernail. You got a guy in front with a normal size paddle called the avant, who knows the route. All you guys in the middle of the canoe are known as the milieu. You're just the engine room. You're not J-stroking, which takes a lot of energy, that resistance. You're just doing that short chop stroke with a short little paddle, and you're just keeping that momentum of 4 tons driving through the water. So it's like riding your bike downhill. So it's an actually easy paddle. On some days when you're going 60, 70 miles a day and there's no portaging, you can just sit there with those short little chop strokes all day, and you can put it on your lap, have a pipe. Okay, I'll get back to it now. And just because it's that mass in motion. So yeah, it's a whole different, and no one knows how to do that until you do it. No one came into this business knowing how to do it.
I love it. We have a question on here. I wonder if the Montrealers were averaging 26 and 5'7". Were they less Hernians, older and younger? If I'm saying that wrong, feel free to unmute yourself and say it.
Were they mixed age?
Yeah, younger, older.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, we had, there's Rich Williams points out that none of the Voyageurs he found in that report were older than 50. But I was just rereading George Nelson's journals from Lake Winnipeg, and he had several Voyageurs with them who were in their 60s. And they were getting contracts. So there's guys getting contracts from the age of about 16, 17, all the way up until 60s. Yeah.
And then wondering if the winterers were older on average. Those are the winterers.
Oh, yeah. I imagine they probably were, because a lot of them stayed up into the interior. They said they were cleaner sometimes, the winterers. Because they were older, and the Montrealers were more like college kids on spring break. A lot of people they all start as Montrealers, and then they move into the interior. So, I think you could safely say that the guys were older that were the Northmen. I'd go with that.
Well, I'm now inviting people to unmute themselves and ask questions if they'd like. Feel free.
Yeah, I got one. I was going to ask, do you have any information on how the 7 Years' War specifically influenced the lives of Voyageurs, and what books and sources do you have on this?
Yeah, the one those first quotes I started with tonight, were coming from guys who were involved in the F&I, and they didn't speak nicely of French, and you wouldn't expect them to speak nicely of French. What I was trying to make the point by starting with that was that these guys were looked down upon, but once you start hearing quotes from people that worked with them, there was some respect in that. Even Harmon's long quote about them, says that, oh yeah, they can be trouble, but really they're nice guys. And, you see a lot of that in those accounts. That whole 1760, 60 period, it's strange. It's right before I really start getting massively involved with fur trade companies in the 1770s and 80s, So probably books like The Canadian Frontier, I think by Eccles, might be a better book on that. Yeah, I think William Eccles or Eccles, Eccles, Canadian something. That'd be one book I would suggest. And of course, it wouldn't hurt. I don't know how far back the Alan Greer book goes back, but I love his research. So I would definitely check that. Peasant, Lord, and Merchant is the book there. And then there's a guy called Allaire, Allaire, who a Google search should help you find an article he wrote about French voyageurs or engagés. Those are the sources I would go to for that time frame. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. That helps a lot.
Yeah.
So I want to note it is 6:46. I want to keep it at letting people ask questions for a bit, but I want to let those know that maybe need to depart. If you did attend late, I do want to let you know we do have this recorded, so you will be able to view this in the future. It will be available on our website and also be shared with Carl, so he can share it if he wants to anywhere else too. So I encourage you to keep asking questions for a bit. I don't want to keep Carl too long, but go ahead.
Yeah.
Hey, Carl.
Yeah.
This is Rick Nowitzki.
Hey, Rick.
How you doing? First of all, thank you.
Yeah. My pleasure.
Can't believe I've lived here this long and known so little about, known all the wrong things. I'm just curious about the Harmon book, though. That's my question. Yeah. Is that an easy read, or is it pretty? Is it a slog?
It's an easy read. It's a great read. It's my favorite journal. 16 years in the Indian country, and what I love about him, speaking of voyageurs, I always said it before too. He's a guy who's an American working for an English company in charge of French Canadian voyageurs and marrying into a native family. So he's none of the three major players, but he can stand back and see all three of them, which makes it perfect. And I love his line in there about, his town back in Vermont would not let him come back with a native wife. They said, if you're bringing a native woman here, get the heck out of here. We don't want you here. So he said, fine. He gave up his family to live with his native wife. And what was really cool, he was like, a lot of voyageurs, and we talked about this on the last talk, would marry a native woman, have several children, and then move on in 3 years when that post was no longer operable, knowing they could take another young wife someplace else. And that was something that always got stuck in the craw of Mr. Harmon. He said, how can you have children and leave them in the wilderness? Even if you're not married in a church, you're still married under the eyes of God. How can you leave your wife? How can you leave your children? So he's got some pretty eloquent and amazing things to say. Man, I strongly recommend Harmon.
How do I access that without popping $88 on Amazon? I just looked it up.
Oh, I think we have it here usually. Yeah, we usually have copies here for sale.
Thanks.
A lot cheaper than $88.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay. Any way that you can sort of, I don't know, it's not exactly reenacting, but I would love to go on a trip where you're actually in a Voyageur canoe and paddling. Is there any way to do that?
Well, I think Voyageurs does a little bit of that. Voyageurs National Park. They take people out in, I think, 25-foot canoes. And I believe up at Fort William, up in Thunder Bay, they do it as well. So those are the two places I know.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, how long are the trips? How long are the trips?
Oh, they're just a couple, maybe a couple hours. They're not overnight trips.
What about overnight trips?
That I don't know. Yeah. So.
Thank you.
Sure. I mentioned that all these voyageurs from all different places. I mentioned Swedish and African voyageurs, and I don't know if you can see this. This guy right here. This is John Cox. He's a Kanaka. I never said that word today. Kanaka. What the heck is a Kanaka? Well, it's a voyageur. These are the voyageurs that were hired in Hawaii by the Northwest Company and brought here because they were such good canoe men. The Northwest Company had Hawaiian voyageurs brought here, and they were mostly working at Fort Vancouver and Fort George and Fort Astoria and all there in Washington and Oregon, but numerous of ones made it all the way here to Lake Superior and were employed by the company. Now, by that time, we're up at Fort William up in Thunder Bay, and a lot of these married into the natives up there. And some of the earliest children that were not native that were born in Thunder Bay are half native and half Hawaiian. You don't think about Hawaiians when you're in Thunder Bay usually.
Love it. I feel like anybody that had a question for a paper, a school paper, could contact you, and you could give them all the great resources to write about just about anything about the Voyageurs. Does anybody else have any questions?
I got one more cool one. I don't know if you can see it or not. Can you all see that picture right there? That's 1946. These are small, kind of scrawny little guys, right? 1946, they're portaging, right? That's over in Tibet, and they're portaging up a mountaintop. That's as tough as any portage the Voyageurs did, but these guys aren't carrying 180 pounds of furs or trade goods. But these guys, who are about the same size as Voyageurs, these guys are carrying 300 pounds each of tea. These guys are carrying 300 pounds of tea. So it's a tough job.
Bill, did you have a question you were trying to ask? Looks like maybe you were unmuted.
I was just going to say that Daniel Harmon's book is great, and you can get it at the museum store right at Grand Portage, $23. It's a deal.
Yeah. Yeah, the other journal I like a lot is, if I had to pick my favorite journals, Harmon I like 5 Fur Traders of the Northwest by Gates. That's 5 different journals for, at a good price. I like Early Fur Trade of the Northern Plains. That's Northwest Company fur traders like in North Dakota and stuff like that. That's a really good one. So, yeah. And if you like the fur trader voyageurs way up in the Athabascan country, Keith's book, North of Athabasca, that's nothing but journals as well. So that's another good one. The best single book on like what voyageurs were like and what they lived. Well, we're lucky to have one out there that's pretty darn good. And that's Making the Voyageur World by Carolyn Podrukny. So that's a fun one to read. That one gets a little more academic, but.
Carl, would you mind sharing with us about the reenactment time that's happening at Grand Portage National Monument this summer?
Well, yeah, second weekend of August, of course, is our rendezvous days when about 300 reenactors and all the big canoes show up for about a 4 or 5 day festival here. This year, I think it's like the 11th to the 15th or something like that. So yeah, this year we're going to have a lot of special things. We actually are bringing in Lac LaCroix ponies. There's only about 200 in the world. They were down to only 3 or 4 in the world. And this is a type of horse that was bred by the Ojibwe and that was used in the fur trade. And they're one of the rarest breeds of horses, and they were developed on the Canadian-Minnesota border. And we actually have some people coming from a ranch that have some Lac LaCroix or Ojibwe spirit horses, and they'll be here for rendezvous giving presentations. One of the early visitors to Grand Portage in the 1790s was an Italian count who was more known as one of the first hot air balloonists in the world. So we'll actually have a guy here talking and demonstrating some 18th century hot air balloons. So about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, and they'll be launched into the air, these large giant balloons. But you'll also see all the Voyageurs out in the lake. We'll have all the contests, the games, the kitchen will be cooking. Historic 18th century puppet show with Punch and Judy, that's returning after a couple of years. So that is the time to visit us, is during the rendezvous. So witness about 160 tents and 160 fires laid out. Of course, at the same time that the rendezvous is going on, the reenactors, some of them directly related to voyageurs who were here. Mr. John Prenovo in our camp carries copy of contracts showing his family members coming here in the 1700s. At the same time, of course, the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, likely have their powwow going on just up the hill from us. So it's a 2-for-1. You can come for the powwow and come for the rendezvous, and Grand Portage comes alive that weekend. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing about that. I think it is so dynamic, and we've all been sad that with the last couple of years we've not been able to do it. But if it's safe to do again, I think we'll be glad to be together.
We hope. Yeah.
If they have interest in maybe being reenactors, who do they talk to?
Yeah, go right to our website. We have the whole thing on there, how to join to be a reenactor, suggestions on clothing. You can contact the park and write the park, and ask me or Ranger Steve, and we'll all be glad to help you out. Yeah, so everything there. Our website's being vastly overhauled and changed recently, so there's a lot of fun stuff up there. And of course, if you've never seen our award-winning park film, that is now available for free on our website. If you've never seen that film, there you'll have a view of what the rendezvous is like, and of course the fur trade here in Grand Portage. So I highly recommend watching that film.
And if they come up on just a regular Tuesday, what's happening up there?
Well, we're open 7 days a week. We're open every single day. You can watch the film on the big screen, look at some thousands of artifacts here in the museum. And in late May, we'll reopen the historic site. But right now, the museum is open, artifacts are here, the film is here, and we're open 7 days a week, totally free, 8:30 to 4:30 every single day.
And if they come in May, will they see you dressed up and talking to people?
I'm looking forward to jumping in, getting out of the gray and green and putting on my reenacting clothing starting in May. Yeah.
And it is a mix. You can go anytime during the summer and you'll see a variety of people interacting with you that can have lots of good conversations.
Yeah, I'm ready to start on a new canoe this year. So if you want to come visit and watch me make a birch bark canoe, come visit.
I got a last question in here that somebody asked about the relationship between Old Fort William and Grand Portage. Could you mention a bit?
Yeah, well, what happened was I always tell people, and I laugh at this, we are a British company run by Scots with French Canadian paddlers trading to the sovereign nations of natives and operating illegally on US soil. That's what happened. So in 1802, it was our last rendezvous with threats of US taxation. The Northwest Company, this juggernaut based out of Montreal, even though their inland headquarters was in Grand Portage, we have realized, yes, we indeed are by 6 miles in the United States. So after the rendezvous meeting of 1802, they moved the entire operations up, about 45 minutes up to Thunder Bay and rebuilt this place and renamed it Fort William. Actually, we renamed it New Fort. And then after a couple of years, we had to change the name again because, probably because it wasn't new anymore. And then we called it Fort William. So we just moved to avoid threats of US taxation, and Grand Portage becomes Fort William. And then it stayed Fort William until the 1821 merger with the Hudson Bay Company. There you go.
If you're anybody like me that might be looking up the words Old Fort William, that's no longer what they call themselves. So
yeah, Fort William Historical Park. I think, it's kind of like the Fur Post in Pine City, Minnesota. A lot of different name changes over the years.
All the same places though. And we did have somebody mention that they are able to do tours in the bigger canoes. Check out the chat for that part. Well, everyone, I just want to say thank you for coming. And I want to say especially thank you to Carl. I honestly, every time I say I lived here, I grew up here, I've been to all the places and I learned a lot then, but these moments learning from you are just priceless. And I'm sure everybody else here agrees. So thank you so much.
I had lots of fun.